to this point, we have covered all three components from our three-component model. We started with our sensory registers, we talked about our working and short-term memory, and we focused on the distinction between the two. And then we also talked about long-term memory. And so for today, we're actually going to start looking at these these bits and pieces, these actions that are allowing us to move information from one of our components to the other. So we're going to look at encoding, we'll talk about some of the rehearsal stuff, we'll talk about retrieval, and also storage, the act of keeping things in our long-term memory. So we're going to start with encoding. And so encoding is how we're getting information into the system by translating it into a neural code that your brain can process. And so we've already talked about the fact that this happens twice. So you take sensory information and translate it for use in your short-term or working memory. And then you also take short-term and working memory information and translate it for long-term storage. So if we go back, encoding is here between our sensory registers and the short-term/working memory, but also here between our working short-term memory and our long-term memory. So encoding is just how we're translating information from one form to the other so that we can use it somewhere else. So encoding information is going to be an effortful process, or can be an effortful process. A lot of times we're intentionally trying to remember things. And if it's intentional, we're putting effort and energy into remembering it. So studying for your exam is an effortful process that will allow you to encode that information, hopefully, so it ends up in your long-term storage. It is not always effortful. Sometimes there's automatic processing that happens. So this is going to be an unintentional process requiring minimal attention. So it's stuff that you're going to remember just because you remember it, not because you're trying to remember it. So I can ask you what you did yesterday, and you can have sort of a vague recollection of some of the activities that you partook in. But you weren't necessarily sitting there while doing those activities, forcing yourself to remember them happening. So it can be effortful and it can be automatic, but both are options for encoding information. So when we're encoding information, specifically for our effortful processing, we come across this pretty standard rule that for these levels of processing, the deeper you're processing, the more information, the more you're manipulating and doing to that information, the better your recall will be. And so for our levels of processing theory, we can look at information and try and recall it when we have dealt with it at different levels for that processing. So on this list here, these are 3 different levels of processing that are standardly used when people are trying to remember lists of words. In the last lecture, we talked about how much psychologists love lists when studying memory, and that's going to be a continuing theme. So for these types of processing, they're going to go from the top, where there is very little processing, very shallow processing, and then as we progress down, we'll get into deeper processing, where you get more intense consideration of the word. So the idea here is that towards the top, less processing means you're not going to remember it as well, and at the bottom is deeper processing, you're doing more with it, so you should remember it more well. And so for these, if we have a structural level of processing, you might be asked something about the structure of the word. So you could be shown a word and you're asked, is the word in capital letters or is it in lowercase? And that's the only thing about the word that you're asked to process. So you think about, is it capitals or small letters? And that's it. For our next level, phonemic processing, You could be asked something like, does the word rhyme with cheer? And they can ask, does it rhyme with whatever? But in order to answer the question, you have to then think about what the word on your list actually sounds like. So if you are given the word beer, then you would say that yes, it does rhyme with cheer. And so by making that connection, by processing the word, figuring out what it sounds like, and sort of contemplating if it sounds like something else, you're processing it just a little bit deeper than you did in the first step where they just asked if it was in capitals or not. And for our last level of processing, this is the semantic. And we've heard this word semantic a couple of times already. But in this case, we're looking at does the word fit in this sentence? So we're trying to get meaning from this word. So he saw the blank. So you have to think about this word in terms of what it means and how it might fit into that sentence. So if we used our example from up here where I said beer, he saw the beer, yeah, it kind of works. But if we were looking at a color word and it was he saw the blue, that doesn't really make sense, so that doesn't really work. But to answer this question, you then have to think about the meaning of the word, and that's why it's deeper processing. And so if we want to see in action how deeper processing facilitates stronger recall, then we can look at our graph here. So we have using a structural level of processing, our phonemic level of processing, or our semantic level of processing, and then how many of the words from their list they correctly recalled. And so here, if you just were asked something structural, if you were asked if it's in capital letters, people would remember just over 40% of the words from their list. If you had a little bit of a deeper meaning to it, if they ask you if it rhymes with something else, if you have to think of what it sounds like, people were remembering about 65% of the words. And then if you had a semantic processing for the words, if you had to think about what it meant, you're remembering 90% of the words on the list. So this is showing that yes, deeper processing facilitates stronger recall. And so continuing on with this effortful processing and trying to remember these things, we've already kind of mentioned rehearsal as that idea of trying to maintain things in your short-term memory, say your grocery list, and you're going to repeat your grocery list over and over and over again. You're going to rehearse it until you get to the grocery store. Maintenance rehearsal is the correct term for that simple repeating of the information over and over again. This works well enough to keep that information in your short-term memory for the short term, but it isn't the best way to help us encode information for long-term remembering. So sitting and repeating the same terms over and over again isn't going to be the best way to improve your recall. Just reading the slides over and over won't necessarily help you study for a test. If you want to have better recall, you should use elaborative rehearsal. So rehearsal because you're still rehearsing or repeating the information, but this time we're elaborating, we're not just maintaining, we're going to add to the information. So if you're looking at your slides and reading those over and over again, start adding to it. Start thinking about what do the words mean? Is there anything here that I can connect to other concepts? What does it make me think of? What other images does it bring to mind? And by adding extra information, you're having a deeper processing of what you're looking at, and you're going to be able to encode it better so you remember it better. And additionally, the way that we arrange information can help us enhance our memory. So if you put information together in a meaningful way, you can remember those things better. Kind of like when I was talking about my grocery list last time and I said I needed eggs and milk and bread because I was making French toast. So my recipe And how I would make that toast is providing a meaningful arrangement of the items that I'm getting, because I can remember the order that I'd use them in the recipe, which is going to enhance my memory. And this scheme can serve as what's called a cue to help aid in retrieval of information. So my scheme would be remembering a recipe. So I can remember I'm here for French toast, and I know the stuff that I need to make French toast. When we're talking about a cue, this is just some kind of stimulus that acts as an indicator, a hint that gets you thinking the right way to retrieve information. So a cue can help you find information or remember information that you might not have been able to remember without that hint. And we'll come back to these cues when we start talking about priming in just a couple of slides. And so while we're on the topic of helping us remember better, I want to talk about some of our tricks for doing this. And these tricks are called mnemonic devices. And so these are mental strategies that aid us in remembering information. So if you've ever been taught an acronym that stands for something to help you remember things. So if you're Canadian, you might have been taught HOMES as an acronym for the Great Lakes: Huron, Ontario, Michigan, Erie, and Superior. Or maybe you were taught a phrase that helps you remember the colors in the rainbow or the spectrum, or a phrase that helps you remember the names of the planets. There's lots of different types of techniques, and they're all just sort of tricks or mental strategies to help us with remembering. And so we're going to talk about 4 broad categories of mnemonic devices. So we're going to talk about our simple types of devices, some visual-based, semantic, and complex ones. And of course, each gets their own slide, so we'll go into detail there instead of here. For our simple mnemonics, you can use something like a hierarchy. Organize items based on how they're related to each other. So again, we're bringing in some kind of meaning to help add some deeper processing to let us remember. So for example, you could think of a house, which is part of a neighborhood, which is part of a city, which is part of a country, and so on. And these extra associations enhance our memory. You could also use chunking, which we already talked about, as a way that we make use of our limited short-term memory. But chunking can also help with long-term storage as well, because we're combining items into larger units of meaning. So you could remember, instead of remembering sort of blue and red and yellow independently, you could just remember that they're the 3 primary colors. And so now you only have to remember one thing instead of 3 separate things. Just little simple tricks to remember. And again, another graph to show how we would see this in practice. So if we have meaning to that information, it's a lot easier to recall it. So if we were given a group of words and we had a hierarchy where we could relate them, our city and then our town and then our neighborhood and then our town and then our country and then whatever, you're able to recall more words than if there's only a random hierarchy, if there isn't actually any meaning to it. So if you were talking about oranges and something that isn't a fruit, baseball bats and flowers, there's no connection, there's no hierarchy there, so you'd recall less of those things. For our next one, actually the title isn't changed, but this is supposed to be for our visual-based imagery. I'm not sure why that didn't carry over, but this is our visual imagery because we're looking at a bunch of images. For visual-based stuff, you can have a couple of different ways to help you remember things well. And this is remembering multiple things. It's easier to remember them if they're interacting with one another, and if they're bizarre. And for this, being bizarre is just something out of the ordinary, where it's not doing its normal function. So here we have a piano smoking a cigar, which is not normal for either of those items. So it's bizarre because you wouldn't expect to see that. And that novel, odd quality actually helps us remember those things just a little bit better. And then the interaction, where it's a piano smoking a cigar, is an extra level of processing that makes it easier to remember. And you could try and just remember non-interacting and non-bizarre images where you envision a piano and you envision a cigar, but it's actually a lot easier to have extra levels where they're interacting and something weird is happening. And you can have them not interacting but being weird, or interacting and not being weird, but this is the best of our options. And apparently all of my titles are wrong, so next we're going to be looking at semantic mnemonics. Oh no, it is here. Okay. I thought that it was going to be wrong for a long time, but it's just the one slide. I apologize. For our semantic mnemonics, we can have things like the first letter technique, just like we had talked about with our homes analogy. That is a first letter technique where we have condensed the first letters of the words to make a phrase. Or we can use Roy G. Biv as a mnemonic for remembering the order of the colors of the rainbow. Another semantic mnemonic, where we're getting into the semantics or meanings of things, you could have a narrative technique. So tell a story that's involving all of the items that you need to remember. And that can help you remember those things because you're adding extra information to help you with the processing. And our last type of mnemonic are the complex mnemonics. And this one is kind of interesting. It's called the method of loci. And you want to link the things you need to remember with a place that you know very well. If you've watched any TV shows of Sherlock Holmes, especially the BBC one, when he talks about his mind palace, that's a method of loci. So you use in his case, made up location, his mind palace, and you use that location to help you remember things within that location. And so I much prefer talking about a real world example. So maybe you're trying to remember your grocery list and you're going to use your own house as your location to link those items to. And so now you're going to remember your grocery list based on the things that you need for each room of the house. So start by standing in the kitchen. What do you need from the kitchen? Maybe you need butter, and that's it from the kitchen. And then you can go stand in your bathroom, and you envision yourself standing in your bathroom, and you need toothpaste. So you know what you need for that room. And then go stand in your laundry room, and you need laundry detergent. And so when you go to the grocery store, in your mind, you can mentally walk through your house and think about what you need for each individual room. And so by linking the thing you need with the room that you need it for, it helps you remember those items just a little bit better. And if you look into this method, there's a lot of really cool and complex ways to use it, but we keep it nice and simple for this class.